Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Enterprise AI Show. I'm your host, Brian Gracely, and today we're going to dive into sort of the second installment of what I call the top 10 enterprise AI questions that every leader should be asking themselves and should be digging into. And this one came from a message board. Actually, it came from the Software Defined Talk Slack. A gentleman asked about, how do we improve the collaboration within our team, right? We've got lots of people starting to use AI at, different mechanisms with different, processes and so forth. And he feels like they have a little bit of consistency in place in terms of the tools. They're not all over the place, but they just can't seem to sort of figure out governance and best practices, right? They've got lots of people, kind of going cowboy and doing it, their own way and so forth. And I thought it was a great question. It's a question that doesn't necessarily have a distinct answer yet, but I want to kind of dig into a way of thinking about it and some things that we probably as an industry need to come together and start to figure out if we expect to see sort of the returns and the value created out of enterprise AI. So we're going to dig into that after the break. Today's show is sponsored by ShareGate. You're out of time. Copilot needs to be deployed ASAP, but your tenant really isn't ready for it. Years of data, permissions, and users lurk in its shadows, ready to be exposed by AI. ShareGate Protect sees it all, so you can find the exposure risks, fix them fast, and deploy AI with confidence. Microsoft 365 Governance, they've got this. Learn more at sharegate.com/protect. Today's show is sponsored by Nasuni. There's a growing gap in AI right now between what's possible in theory and what successfully works at scale inside an enterprise. The difference comes down to unstructured file data. Many AI initiatives struggle because the file data they depend on is scattered, unstructured, and disconnected from where and how work actually happens. Nasuni changes that. It brings your unstructured file data into a single, secure foundation so AI, both generative and agentic, can access it with the context, governance, and performance it needs in production. Bring AI to where your unstructured data lives. See what it takes to activate your data for AI and request a demo at nasuni.com/AI. And we're back. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, we're going to dig into this question, one of the 10 questions that I've been working on as far as, I think top 10 enterprise AI questions that every CIO or every leader should be asking themselves. And this one sort of, like I mentioned, spawned out of somebody asking about, how to improve the consistency, the governance, the collaboration within their team. And I think it's a great question. And I think it's worth kind of diving into. And it's interesting because I think we're seeing it in a couple of ways. One, we're starting to see it as more and more companies are trying to figure out, especially enterprise companies, are trying to figure out the best way to leverage AI technology to get ROI out of the big investments they're making. And it's different. It's different than what individuals have been able to accomplish, right? I know, Brandon and I have talked about, his sort of AI first approach to things and sort of fallen in love with Claude. And, that's one approach, but it's very, individual centric type of thing. And even he said that, a lot of the value that's being created out of AI is really kind of coming bottom up. It's end users doing things and so forth. But I think it's interesting because if that ends up becoming the norm, then we sort of lose the value of the company. We lose the value of team. And that may or may not be relevant in what you're doing with the goals you're trying to achieve. But I thought it'd be interesting to dive into kind of looking at this from an enterprise perspective. The broader question the person asked was, how do we introduce sort of enterprise level governance, standardization? And in their quest, they were asking about sort of agentic coding. So they were talking about, sort of development-centric use cases. But I think this is really, as I look through this, I've got 5 or 6 points that I'd love to dive into. And the first one is, this is not a coding-specific problem. Every team is going to end up having this problem, whether you're in marketing or legal or sales or whatever it might be. They're all going to struggle with this for a couple of reasons, right? First and foremost, and let's just assume for a second that, within any given team, they might have picked and standardized on a set of tools they're using. Maybe they're using, the Google Gemini tools. Maybe they're using, Anthropic and Claude. Maybe they're using some stuff that's built by OpenAI. Maybe they're, using some things that they built themselves. Let's take out of the equation the fact that there are still lots and lots of tools out there companies haven't standardized on them. I mean, you're going to find in most companies that they're using all sorts of things. So they might have signed up for a Copilot account, and a bunch of people have that with their Office 365, but maybe they're using, Gemini or, Claude or Cursor for some of their development stuff. And, even when you have that variety of tools out there, and you're going to get certain things get shared and other things don't get shared. So let's sort of take that off the table right now, because that's going to complicate things even more. So first and foremost, I think this question that he asked is really not a coding specific problem. Now, it is a problem within the coding space, within the software development space, but it's, like I said, it's a problem that's going to hit every single domain, every single group, whether again, sales or marketing or finance or, whatever your organization does. The problem is, how do we get multiple people, because most AI interactions, at least today, are very sort of end user centric, individual centric, like my experience with AI, me asking questions, prompting, having it go off and do research. The tools themselves aren't great at sharing. And I know we're beginning to see a little bit of sort of enterprise capabilities, but they're not necessarily, even at the level of like, hey, it's Teams with SharePoint built in. And so it's easy to say, hey, we did some stuff. We had a conversation. That file went into a centralized repository folder that anybody knows how to use. You don't have to have like GitHub skills to figure stuff out. So we're a very, very long way from the things that we do today with basic collaboration, whether it's around Google tools or Microsoft tools or Slack tools or whatever, to where we are with the stuff that's sort of AI infused. So that's the first thing, is that if you figure out a way to solve this problem, you're going to hopefully be able to pass along those learnings to other teams. But this is a team level problem. This is not a capability level problem or a domain level problem. And I think it really kind of boils down to, if your processes weren't well defined to begin with, they're probably going to be worse now. Right. And we've seen this with other, transitions we've seen. We sort of said, hey, if you weren't good at IT before, you're not going to be good at cloud. And, we're sort of saying the same thing. Like, if you weren't really good at cloud in terms of automating things and, having the ability to do self-service for stuff, you're probably going to have a hard time with AI. Or if your team wasn't great at, data management, you're probably not going to be great at AI, because you're going to spend a lot of time doing data scrubbing and ETL and those sort of things. So first and foremost, if your team is struggling, the first thing you kind of have to ask yourself is, are our processes well defined and enforced? And enforcement is probably as big a thing, right? So you're going to hear people say, "Well, we've got some standards for what we do, but there's a lot of folks that they kind of start with the standard and then they deviate off on their own way." Or there's duplication of like, well, we have a system in place to do centralized tracking or discovery, but people don't like it, so they built their own, right? So if your processes aren't well defined and well enforced, you're going to struggle to get started, right? So that's going to be your starting point. And I think the challenge right now in this early way of thinking about it is, it's not just, are your processes standardized, but do you have buy-in to that standardization? Because the other thing, when we have stuff, especially with these AI tools or Claude tool or whatever it is, if people are all doing it differently and they're not bought into doing it the way that people kind of collectively agreed upon, you're going to keep having this variation, this fragmentation of what's good and so on and so forth. So that's the first thing. And that's going to be the hardest thing, because any kind of standardization, any sort of enforcement is going to have its pros and cons in terms of, yes, there are probably some benefits, there are probably some efficiencies that are gained, there's some governance you can wrap around it. And then you're going to have a lot of people who start to say, I feel like you're restricting me. You're holding me back. You've become the department of no within our own team. And again, this is how, so much technology gets adopted, is that there is a path that doesn't involve any governance or doesn't involve any restrictions. It's the easy path. It becomes the shadow AI, shadow agentic, shadow whatever. And then there's the sort of more difficult path that has guardrails, that has, accountability to it, that has enforcement. And, those are difficult problems to solve, right? This is not unique to AI. It's just that, right now with AI, it is a tool or set of tools that just give people so much capability, more so than was there before, that it is sort of, it's hard to get the horse back in the barn, to use an old sort of American statement. The second thing I think is, especially if we take this from a governance standardization perspective, that tends to align with the idea of a managerial request, right? Somebody at a manager level or a VP level, somebody from an overseeing perspective is saying, that's important to me. And I think the challenge right now is that everything moves so fast, it's almost comical to think that the managers have the answers. The reality is, the managers, the people who aren't necessarily doing the work, who aren't as hands-on every day with the technology, because as part of getting into the managerial track, you are going to be naturally less hands-on with the technology. You're going to be, doing more things, overseeing stuff and budgeting and focused on hiring and all sorts of other stuff that are important at a manager level, but you're going to be spending less time with the AI. And so the idea that if this mandate for centralization or governance comes along and it comes from the top down, as opposed to, the bottom up team just saying like, hey, everything's chaos, folks, we need to work this out together. The managers aren't going to have the answers. They're not going to give you, the answers to the tests. They're oftentimes going to be like, well, this is being mandated, or come on, folks, we can do better. Yeah, I know we can. I've seen some things out there on the internet that show that other companies are doing it better. And then the other piece that's a problem is, even if they're not just mandating stuff, even if they're trying to work stuff out, right now, so many of the current measurements aren't terribly useful, right? So, I mean, we had Sam Ramji on, and he was talking about, what his company was doing. And granted, they're a startup, and he was talking about things like tokenmaxxing. And we're hearing, people trying to figure out metrics in some way that are relatable to things. So, how many tokens should I give an engineer, or how many tokens should I give to somebody? Or, is somebody doing work that's valuable enough to deserve a $20 a month subscription, $100 a month subscription, $1,000 a day subscription? Like, we don't know yet how to measure this stuff. And so we keep sort of trying to do this, but what ends up happening is, so many things come out of Silicon Valley and they sort of get amplified. And so we get vibe coding and token maxing and, these things of Jensen Huang saying like, hey, if you're not spending as much money on tokens as you are on salary, then you're underutilizing your engineers. Like, those are fine for headlines, and they get some buzz and they're interesting on Reddit for a week or something, but they don't help a business that's like, hey, my job is not to be, we're not in the agentic business. We're in the other capability to the marketplace business. Agentic is just a way for us to get there, or accelerate us getting there, or AI's way of getting there. We haven't figured out the language and the measurements to do this. And because the managers don't know the technology any better, they don't know the best practices. We're in a lot of situations in which somebody is saying like, hey, go do this stuff. They don't know what the next step of it is. They don't know what the answer to the question that they're asking people to do. And so the stares that come back from the people that are being asked to do it are, it's a lot of silence. It's a lot of like, okay, what next? What do you want us to do? How are you going to measure success? What should we do? What shouldn't we do? And so, this is going to be a situation in which managers are going to be challenged to figure out how to dig in. They're going to be challenged to figure out how to, come up with some things that might have a bunch more baby steps than they're used to doing, right? And to a certain extent, they're going to look for leaders, sub-leaders within their teams to be their partner in figuring this out from an employee manager perspective. Okay. Third thing I have on my list is the governance tools that people kind of expect don't really exist in this domain yet. In fact, I know that because the number of requests that we get from people that want to come on the show and talk to us about their startup or their experience in having building these governance tools or these orchestration tools, orchestration for AI agents or governance tools for AI agents and so on and so forth. Like, the number of those has gone through the roof in the last 6 months. I mean, that's probably 1 out of every 3 requests that we get on the podcast. And that's just people doing startups, let alone, people with any real experience. So the tools don't really exist yet. And the reality is, like, it's not clear that everybody wants them. Right. I mean, I don't know if it was on this podcast or if it was on Software Defined Talk. We were reviewing the Google I/O conference, and Google, for all of the interesting technology they're building in AI, basically said, well, you're going to need a repository. You're going to need a registry for your skills, or you're going to need a registry for your agents, and you're going to need a catalog for stuff, and you're going to want to give self-service access to be able to do this, that, and the other. And it's not totally clear that people are like, okay, hold on a second. Like, you're you're going to solve the new problem with old ways of doing that. And it's not clear that like the old ways are the best ways, right? So, but the same sort of problems exist. How do we populate these catalogs? How do we avoid duplicates? How do we know what's best? How do we do, basic discovery? Like, is it just one centralized catalog? Do different teams have the ability to do stuff? So there's a lot of like the values being created bottom up because people are creating new skills and doing stuff. But, how it's being paid for and mandated top down doesn't necessarily know what's best. And, like I said, it's not clear that anybody wants them. They didn't necessarily love them before, right? I mean, it's not like you have a lot of people going home and being like, man, that self-service experience I had today at work was awesome, right? The only people you ever hear sort of saying that are the folks at Google who talk about the amazing internal Google tools. But yet you never figure out, those folks never, every time they leave Google and then try and build that tool, they never find, widely loved adoption within the enterprise. So it doesn't, AI is not going to necessarily be any different in that sense. So, trying to take the old paradigm that it was, to service discovery and catalogs and registries and whatever else it might be, there's huge opportunity to go rethink like, how do we do this better? And then, the other piece of it is like, how do you define that governance, right? I mean, I think, saying like, how do we put governance around this, I think might be an opportunity to say, hey, what are the baby steps we need to even start getting there, right? Like, how do we even do, once you figure out that Bill or Mary or Tom or, Sally or whoever has created a skill and you go, oh, that sounds really interesting. We reviewed it in the meeting and then they're able to put a number against it, an improvement number, a validation number, whatever that is. Oh, I did this thing. I used this skill. Here was the prompt, stuff we did. And here was the harness I used. And here was the output. Here was the result. Then how do you go about being like, okay, first and foremost, can we reuse that? Like how much change has to happen to reuse that? How much basic sharing? What would be the easiest way to share this? What would you guys like to do for sharing, right? Like what are those capabilities? And I think there's a lot of baby steps that are needed before we can get to this idea of sort of full-blown governance. And I know that might sound sort of naive of like, well, if you're not thinking big picture, you're going to end up with lots of little baby steps that never can kind of be brought together. But at the same time, again, if you only start with boiling the ocean, you're never going to get there either. And so I think a lot of this is coming back to this idea of, this isn't going to be a top-down only driven thing. It's not going to be a bottom-up only, shadow type of thing, and shadow will figure it out. It's going to have to be a lot of top-down, bottom-up, meeting in the middle, figuring out, what's important, how are we going to measure these things, what are the baby steps we can take, how do we prove those things out. That same theme is sort of coming up over and over again as I think through this challenge. Now, what it leads me to wonder, and again, I don't know if anybody wants to hear this, are we going to, do we want to be reinvesting or, ready to invest again in this idea of centers of excellence, right? One of the ways that many companies have tried to solve this in the past, enterprises have tried to solve this is, there's always going to be people that want to live at sort of the bleeding edge of new capabilities, whether that's because they're curious or they're technically inclined or they're, pushing to get a bigger job or a title or something along those lines. So there's lots of reasons for doing it. But you kind of have to figure out a mechanism that says, how do we build success or excellence at a small scale before we can sort of mandate it at a big scale? And so it won't surprise me if we start to see AI centers of excellence start popping up across companies. I think if that's something that's on your radar, you probably should be, exploring around the industry for cloud centers of excellence and DevOps centers of excellence and all sorts of things, because that's a topic that is, got a lot of tread. A lot of tread has worn off those tires in the past, and some have been successful and some haven't been successful. And there are a lot of lessons to be learned there in terms of, who can be in it, how do you fund it, what timeline should you be looking at, all those sorts of things. And maybe that's another topic for another day. But, the concept of center of excellence has been around. It's had mixed reviews, mixed success, but it wouldn't surprise me if we start seeing those things pop up as a result of people figuring out like, hey, how do I get teams or teams of mixed agents and humans working together on these types of things. Fifth thing I have on my list is I think we vastly underestimate the creativity element in the human buy-in, right? So part of getting these things to work out, whether it's just team collaboration or governance or standardization with accountability, is, it's one thing. And this is what always sort of frustrated me when I would read books like The Phoenix Project. And, as much as I love Gene, and we've had Gene out a number of times, we probably have to have him on again soon because I know he's doing some work in AI, he always wanted to draw this comparison to the Toyota manufacturing process or Toyota manufacturing system. I forget what the exact name was, but that industrial process and how they went about doing it and how they dealt with failures and so forth, and him trying to apply that to, the IT process. And the reason it kind of would frustrate me was that process, the Toyota process, while he could draw a number of parallels, and there were some very good parallels. And I know, John Willis would dive into stuff and talk about Deming and all the parallels to that. And they're fine. There are a number of parallels that make a ton of sense. But there's also the aspects of this that the folks on the manufacturing line weren't the creative people in this process, right? Like the creativity piece of it really happened in designing the car, the aerodynamics of the car or the horsepower of the engine or whatever. These folks' job was to drive process and to drive process efficiency. And the other part was, once that car left the line and it got out of the manufacturing plant, it didn't come back to that plant for rework. It's not like software where it's like, when the technical debt kind of piles up, it comes back to the same people to fix it. If a car goes off the line and then it has problems, it goes into a service center somewhere. It goes into something completely different. And so there were parallels that didn't necessarily make sense. So why do I bring all that stuff up? Is I think as we start to look at this thing about doing standardization, you have to distinctly think about how much, as you're asking people to standardize on stuff, and especially standardize on tools for a process, how much do they think of themselves as being the engine of success versus the tool or the system being the engine of success? So for example, if you went to somebody who was a marketing manager of a product or something, and you said, hey, I want all of our product managers to start, or marketing managers to all start to work the same way. And this could be, a software engineering architect or whatever, apply to any job you want. But there's a lot of creativity element. There's a lot of pride. There's a lot of like, hey, I've got experience that you kind of have to overcome, because what you're going to start running into is, how is the success measured? Was the success of that presentation that went out and helped the field sell a bunch of whatever our product was and close a big deal and help us make the quarter and, make the stock price go up? How much of that was your experience, your creativity, your brilliant idea, and how much of that was the tool itself, right? And I think people, humans inherently are going to bias to the, hey, most of that was me, right? Like most of that was, like if a great piece of literature got written, but it was written on a word processor as opposed to a keyboard, the authors aren't like, oh man, the word processor did so much work. They're just like, it was a tool in the process. But I think as we get into AI and it blurs the line between like, how much did you do and how much did the thing do? And that impacts, kind of their standing in the world. We're going to get into some very interesting situations. And so I think we do underestimate that creativity element in the human buy-in. So as you're trying to get people to buy into it, there's a lot of elements there. How much is success a measurement of improvement, or is it just a leading indicator towards replacement? How much of it did you do? We don't know how to measure those things, right? And, even the people that I know that are really kind of enamored with using AI tools, you're oftentimes going to walk away from a project and be like, well, I really liked the outcome of that, but how much of that did I do? And how much of that was the tool? How much of that was me collaborating with the tool and in partnership with the tool? And you may start to question yourself of like, well, wait a second, I used to be like 80 or 90% of it with the tool. Am I only like 50% of it now? And is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? Do I want to tell people that the tool really helps me move faster than I work? And, so there's a big aspect of that I think we vastly underestimate, that, because we're seeing some of these external things, like a company X lays off 1,000 people and AI is blamed as the reason for it, whether or not that is directly involved with you or it's like your situation, those little things start to, they start to become, nuggets in people's brain of like, oh, hold on, I would like to buy in. I think if I buy in, I'm going to become much better at my job, but I just don't know what the new dynamics are of what the combination of those things are. So I think we have to think very hard about how are we going to interact between that, push versus pull versus adoption versus pushback. There's still a lot to be figured out in that space. And then finally, and again, I'm coming back to this same theme. It's probably the best summary of all of this. The top down and the bottom up are going to really need to find some common languages and some common ground, right? They really have to ask themselves, have they walked a mile in each other's shoes yet, right? Do you still know what it's like to be writing code? Do you still know what it's like to be building that presentation for that product launch that's due in a couple of weeks, but has to go through 7 different review cycles? I mean, are you even involved with that anymore? I know you did it 5 years ago or 8 years ago, but do you understand what we're dealing with now? Do you understand, how the creative process works? How do the create process, the input process work, the review process works? I think there's a lot of that's going to happen. I think, we're going to have to figure out between those groups, how do they bring a certain reality to the hype versus the demands versus the learning curve. There's going to be plenty of sort of top down. We're going to be an AI first company. You will adopt these tools to, okay, cool. I want to do those things, but how are you going to help me learn them? How are you going to help me accelerate my learning path? How are you going to, you found 2 people in your group that really are good at that stuff. How are they going to help the rest of the team learn that? Or is the expectation that they did it themselves, right? And so therefore, the rest of you should do that themselves, right? So again, a lot of these things come back to some stuff we dealt with before, but I think the sort of last piece of this that I think we're going to have to start figuring out is, what are the measurements going to be? How are we going to start figuring out how to measure how long a AI-centric cycle is versus what used to be a pre-AI-centric cycle, right? Again, goes back to, did we measure that really well before? Did we understand what the levers were that made that pre-AI-centric cycle successful versus slow versus bottlenecked versus, breakthroughs? And then, how do we measure it against the new one? And again, there's going to be a lot of factors that go into that, whether it's the human aspect, the number of tokens that were used, the cost that was involved, the learning curve that was involved. So I don't know that I have an answer to that original question of like how to create better governance and standardization and, not have duplication and bad best practices and so forth. But I think if we think about it, and, using those 5 or 6 items that I had, I think there are some ways to start to get the teams or an individual team to start figuring out, what they do well, what they can improve on, what are the basic sharings they need, what are the baby steps they can do. How do we bring the top-down approach aligned to the bottom-up approach? Where are there opportunities to be collaborative? It's not going to be easy. There is a lot of factors here that are not just technology. They're not just organizational dynamics or, do we have leaders in the team? There are a lot of psychological things, a lot of things that, we're going to have to measure that we didn't necessarily measure in the past. And so it's going to be a complex set of things. I think it'll be interesting to see when we start seeing some of these lighthouse customers, right? I've mentioned this a number of times in the podcast, right? There was, in the cloud era, it was like, oh, Netflix came out and said, this is how we did stuff. And whether or not a Netflix did stuff in ways that were going to be applicable to you, at least it was a lighthouse to be like, oh, okay, well, maybe that's how the new thing should be. We started having things like the Dora report that would tell us like, well, here's the highest achievers, here's some, higher or better achievers, here's some medium level achievers, and here's some low achievers. Okay. We now started getting data from the marketplace telling us like, okay, this is what great looks like. This is what pretty good look like. We still don't have those sort of things yet. Now, again, will we expect to see those over time? Yeah, absolutely. But I think what's going to be at least as important is not just having some numbers and having some examples, but really having, tangible ways of looking at the problems, looking at possible solutions, looking at new ways to get leadership and individual contributors to start working together. It's a huge opportunity for, people that, have some of those skills. And it'll be very interesting to see how many companies are openly sharing these things. Oftentimes they often share them openly because they're looking for recruiting opportunities, they're looking for better people. Or do we see companies really trying to hold this close to the vest, keep it tight to them because they realize that if they figured it out and they know that a lot of other people haven't figured it out, it is a distinct competitive advantage versus other companies. So anyways, just some stuff to think about. Again, I think it's, one of the top 10 conversations to be figuring out within your organization that every CIO should probably be thinking about, and high level and mid-level managers should be thinking about as well. But as an individual contributor, I think you're going to run into this as well. It's be something that you're thinking about and trying to figure out, like, how do I make this better within my team? Because ultimately, yes, there will be some, quote unquote 10x engineers or 10x marketers or 10x salespeople that come out of this. But the ones who are really going to both help their company and help their career are going to be the ones who, are able to, go with others and go farther with others, right? So anyways, with that, I'll wrap it up. Thank you all for listening. Hope this, beginning of a series of challenging questions is helpful. Would love to get your feedback on these, whether it's the first one we put out the other day, this one, or the 7 or 8 that'll be coming after this. So love to get your feedback. Again, show@theenterpriseaishow.com. Let us know if you've got experience with this stuff, if you've got opinions on this stuff. We'd love to hear it. So with that, I'll wrap it up. We'll talk to you next week.
Thanks for listening. Check us out at theenterpriseaishow.com for past shows, newsletters, and all things enterprise AI.